5 a.m. local time, the treacherous waters of the Gulf of Aden. The USS Ashland, a massive would-be island-class amphibious dock landing ship, was cutting through the dark ocean swells, positioned roughly 330 nautical miles east of Djibouti and 130 nautical miles north of the nearest point on the Somali coast in the volatile Puntland region. The bridge radar screens showed a completely clean picture. It was supposed to be a textbook transit through one of the most heavily militarized and patrolled maritime choke points on the planet. Packed on board the vessel were 397 crew members alongside a combat-ready force of roughly 500 Marines. At that precise moment, a lookout stationed on the port bridge wing was executing a disciplined, routine visual sweep of the horizon. Scanning through heavy binoculars, the lookout's eyes locked onto a faint, dark smudge cutting through the water approximately 4 nautical miles off the port bow. At first glance, it bore the profile of a standard local fishing vessel, a massive, ambiguous category containing dozens of minor variants across every square degree of the Gulf of Aden. But just 60 seconds later, all ambiguity vanished into thin air. The contact was locked onto a dead intercept vector, charging directly toward the USS Ashland at an aggressive 25 knots. It was an assault skiff, measuring approximately 22 feet in length, boasting a stark white fiberglass hull with a single high-output Yamaha outboard motor bolted to the transom. 7 men were visible on board. The helmsman sat aft at the tiller, while 5 militants lined the gunwales, leaving 1 man positioned tightly at the bow. The lookout instantly passed the tactical report up to the officer of the deck. The bridge crew, however, held back from sounding general quarters immediately. A definitive, hostile threat had not yet materialized. The Gulf of Aden routinely crawls with high-speed local civilian craft, and triggering a full combat alarm on a massive amphibious warship housing nearly 1,000 personnel is a disruptive event that nobody takes lightly. Instead, the command was issued to maintain lockdown visual tracking and immediately alert the tactical action officer down in the combat systems center. Over the agonizing 6 minutes that followed, the skiff rapidly closed the distance, cutting the gap from 4 miles down to just 2 miles. At this lethal range, the high-powered optics produced a crystal-clear image that left absolutely zero room for interpretation. In the hands of one of the figures was the unmistakable curved silhouette of an AK-47 assault rifle. Resting heavily on the shoulder of another was the bulky, cylindrical tube of an RPG-7 rocket-propelled grenade launcher. The rest of the crew were visibly armed with various types of military-grade small arms. The lookout spoke a single, decisive word over the internal comms, and within a heartbeat, the warship shifted into a lethal combat posture the crew had drilled for years to perfect. Then, at 0506 hours, the ambush commenced. From the port side of the skiff, a PG-7V high-explosive anti-tank-shaped charge was launched directly toward the USS Ashland's stern. The firing distance was roughly 280 meters, a range that pushed far past the reliable stabilization limits of the rocket's folding fin assembly. The unguided grenade veered wildly off its intended flight path. It roared past the warship's stern at an altitude of just 4 meters above the waterline, smashing into the sea approximately 60 meters behind the ship, where its internal self-destruct fuse instantly triggered a violent detonation. This was a direct, armed engagement against a frontline United States warship. But to fully comprehend how 7 armed men sitting in a fragile fiberglass skiff ended up in the deep waters of the Gulf of Aden, 130 miles from land, making the suicidal decision to wage war on a naval juggernaut, we have to look back. We need to rewind the clock by several hours, and realistically, by several months. The 7 militants originating from the Puntland region had launched their operation from a remote, low-profile fishing village situated on Somalia's northern coastline. Every individual on board was Somali. Not a single man among them had ever successfully executed the hijacking of a commercial merchant vessel in their lives. For the vast majority, their maritime experience was strictly limited, having never traveled further from their native shores than a standard single-day coastal run. To project power out into the deep ocean shipping lanes, they relied on a dedicated mothership, a traditional wooden dhow measuring roughly 60 feet in length, rigged with a classic lateen sail and driven by a rugged Perkins diesel engine, featuring the narrow stern wheelhouse distinct to Yemeni-style vessels. This primary dhow had been violently captured weeks prior from defenseless local fishermen. Stowed deep within its hold was an operational inventory meticulously calculated to sustain a 10-day continuous hunting deployment at sea. Their critical fuel resources were kept strictly segregated. Several 200-liter drums of heavy diesel fed the mothership's main power plant, while a completely separate, highly volatile reserve of gasoline was packed into 20-liter jerry cans to feed the skiff's high-speed outboard motor. Their commercial strategy perfectly mirrored the standard pirate blueprint of that era. Locate an isolated commercial cargo vessel, intercept it at high speed using the attack skiff, preferably striking from two opposing vectors simultaneously, hurl a heavy grappling hook over the gunwales, rapidly scale the boarding ladders, seize absolute control of the ship's bridge by force, navigate the captured prize back to the lawless Somali coastline, and wait out the grueling ransom negotiations. That year, the standard corporate payout fluctuated anywhere between $1.5 and $5 million for a standard mid-sized merchant vessel. However, their maiden deployment collapsed almost immediately, unfolding in a manner the crew had never anticipated. Their hijacked dhow was intercepted in open water by the British Type 22 frigate HMS Chatham, which was operating as a vital component of the multinational Combined Maritime Forces. The Royal Navy boarding team executed a high-risk maritime interdiction under the legal authority of Article 110 of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS. They thoroughly searched the vessel, uncovering the hidden weapons cache and the scaling ladders. Yet, bound by the highly controversial tactical doctrine of that specific era, derisively known across the military as catch and release, the British forces did not place the men under arrest. The international legal frameworks of the time lacked formal, binding prosecution agreements with regional nations, preventing coalition warships from transferring captured piracy suspects to local courts. Consequently, the boarding team confiscated the heavy weaponry, drained a substantial portion of their fuel reserves, and released the men right back onto their wooden dhow with just enough fuel to limp back to the African coast. It was a total operational failure, but it was far from a fatal one. Just a few months later, the exact same syndicate was back out on the high seas, equipped with a brand new interceptor skiff, fresh black market weaponry, and a complete replenishment of fuel. By the first week of April, they had successfully positioned themselves dead center in the Gulf of Aden, holding a fixed station in the shipping lanes and waiting patiently for a viable target to cross their path. That was when a catastrophic mechanical failure struck, one that their business plan was completely unequipped to handle. The mothership's Perkins diesel engine locked up and failed completely. The internal mechanical damage was catastrophic, most likely severe cylinder scoring brought on by heavily contaminated fuel, a chronic issue for pirate operations running on low-grade diesel sourced from hidden underground Somali supply caches. Without the mechanical muscle of its main engine, the dhow was instantly reduced to a basic sailing vessel. In the complete absence of a strong wind, it began drifting aimlessly with the ocean currents at a miserable 1 to 2 knots. This single breakdown completely flipped the tactical equation. A paralyzed dhow, stripped of its mechanical power, can no longer hunt down a moving merchant target, it cannot maneuver to evade relentless coalition naval patrols, and it cannot even maintain its chosen position within the hunting grounds. Their only remaining operational asset was the 22-foot fiberglass skiff. The skiff's integrated hull tank held roughly 80 liters of gasoline, supplemented by 4 additional 20-liter jerry cans, giving them a grand total of 160 liters of fuel. At an optimized economic cruising speed of 18 knots, that fuel volume yielded a maximum one-way operational radius of approximately 100 nautical miles. The moment they opened up the throttle to full assault speed, that range dropped drastically. The nearest point on the Somali coastline lay 130 nautical miles to the south. This meant a grim, mathematical reality. Even if they abandoned the dying mothership immediately and burned a straight path for home, their fuel would run completely dry long before they ever sighted land. They were trapped in the middle of the ocean with only one viable option left on the table. They had to attack the very first target that materialized on the horizon, seize it by force, and either hold it for a map. It is equally plausible that the pirate leader, Farah, and his crew simply possessed no understanding of modern naval warship silhouettes. A local fisherman originating from Bosaso might only catch a fleeting glimpse of a gray hull once or twice in his entire life, and even then, only from a distant beach or port. The blocky silhouette of an amphibious dock landing ship, characterized by its minimal superstructure and sweeping, flat hull lines, is genuinely far more difficult for a civilian to distinguish from a commercial vessel than the stark, weapon-bristling profile of a guided missile cruiser or a destroyer boasting massive sensor masts. Whether this was a genuine case of misidentification or a suicidal, high-stakes gamble born of absolute desperation remains a question that was never answered. At 0506 hours, the PG-7V rocket detonated violently in the ocean spray directly astern of the USS Ashland. Up on the bridge, the warship was already winding up to full combat readiness. The ship's overarching 1MC public address system instantly blared the general quarters alarm. That piercing, rapid electronic tone sequence that every single United States Navy sailor memorizes from the moment they step into boot camp. Within a mere 22 seconds, the entire crew had sprinted through the hatches, locked down watertight doors, and manned their battle stations. The very instant the warship was fired upon, the commanding officer possessed absolute, unilateral legal authority to unleash deadly force under the internationally recognized rules of unit self-defense. There was no need to route requests up the chain of command or wait for authorization from a distant admiral. Mounted on the ship's starboard side, hanging roughly 30 feet above the churning waterline, was a highly advanced, stabilized 38 Malawian Quachas Mod 2 tactical gun mount. At the absolute heart of this weapon system sat the lethal M242 Bushmaster 25mm automatic chain gun, capable of firing single, precision-placed shots or unleashing devastating short bursts at a rate of 200 rounds per minute. At that precise moment, the pirate skiff was cutting through the water approximately 220 meters off the starboard beam, running on a tight parallel course as the militants frantically scrambled to shoulder a second rocket launcher. The 38 Malawian Quachas gunner seamlessly locked the digital reticle onto the center of the skiff's fiberglass hull, targeting the exact area where the engines and fuel were located. The onboard laser rangefinder instantly flashed the exact distance back to the fire control system. The ballistic computer calculated real-time corrections for the roll of the sea state, parallax errors, and the target's relative motion across the water. The gunner pulled the trigger. The very first round, a devastating 25mm armor-piercing incendiary shell, tore clean through the thin fiberglass sidewall of the skiff, impacting right where the volatile gasoline jerry cans were tightly stowed. The skiff instantly erupted into a massive firewall, burning fiercely from bow to stern. One of the militants was thrown violently into the water the moment the heavy shell impacted. The remaining 6 desperately scrambled over the side into the waves to escape the inferno. The abandoned skiff continued to burn furiously for about another minute until the roaring flames finally penetrated the main internal fuel tank, triggering a violent secondary explosion that tore the hull completely apart. Within minutes, absolutely nothing remained of the vessel except a single, charred fragment of the bow section drifting uselessly in the current. 6 men were now left floating in the open ocean. The water temperature in the Gulf of Aden during April hovers around a warm 27 degrees Celsius, completely eliminating hypothermia as an immediate tactical threat. However, the survivors were facing far more terrifying hazards. These specific waters are home to a massive, highly aggressive shark population, including oceanic white-tip and large tiger sharks. Furthermore, 2 of the surviving pirates had sustained severe physical trauma, suffering agonizing fragmentation wounds caused by exploding skiff debris and their own small arms ammunition cooking off under the intense heat of the 38 Malawian Quachas Mod 2 gunfire. From the starboard side of the USS Ashland, 2 rigid hull inflatable boats lowered away into the swells. Packed inside were heavily armed Marines assigned to the 24th Marine Expeditionary Unit, clad in full body armor and gripping M4A1 carbines. The tactical approach to the suspects in the water was executed in strict accordance with standard maritime interdiction procedures. First came the booming verbal commands from the RHIB coxswain shouting through a high-powered bullhorn. "Show me your hands! Do not approach the boat! Do not dive!" Then, one by one, the soaking wet militants were hauled over the tubes and secured. The entire high-stakes recovery operation was completed in a blinding 4 minutes. With the 6 survivors now secured on the main deck, a specialized military medical team was already waiting. The 2 heavily wounded pirates were rushed directly into the ship's advanced sick bay, where naval surgeons immediately began performing emergency debridement to clear shredded fragments from their wounds. The remaining 4 uninjured survivors were systematically isolated deep within the lower hangar bay, securely handcuffed to heavy welded deck fittings under the unblinking eyes of a continuous armed military guard. Eventually, the captured militants were transported under heavy federal escort straight to the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia, located in Norfolk, Virginia. The 6 Somali nationals, Muhammad Ali Sahid, Muhammad Abi Jama, Abdikasai Kabashi, Abdirasak Abshir Osman, Mohammed Farah, and Jamaidal Ibrahim, stood directly before federal judge Raymond Jackson. The primary charge leveled against them was maritime piracy under Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 1651, stacked alongside 7 additional federal counts, including assault on federal officers and the use of a firearm during the commission of a crime of violence. It marked the first formal piracy trial to take place inside a United States federal courtroom since the American Civil War. The defense attorneys countered with a highly unconventional and sophisticated legal strategy. They built their entire case not by trying to deny that the violent firefight had occurred, but by aggressively challenging the precise legal classification of the act itself. First, they boldly claimed that their clients were actually helpless refugees fleeing a war-torn Somalia for a better life in Yemen, and had only drifted into the dangerous vicinity of the USS Ashland by pure accident after their skiff's outboard motor completely failed. The rocket fire and gunshots, the defense team argued, were merely desperate distress signals intended to attract the American ship's attention to secure a rescue. Second, and this served as their central argument, the defense firmly maintained that their clients' aggressive conduct completely failed to meet the strict definition of piracy outlined under Article 101 of UNCLOS. Their core assertion was simple: because the Somali crew had never successfully boarded the USS Ashland and had never actually robbed the vessel, they could not be guilty of piracy, an offense that by classical legal definition requires a completed act of maritime robbery or forceful seizure. On August 17, 2010, Judge Jackson shocked the global legal community by granting the defense's motion and completely dismissing the primary piracy charge. In his formal ruling, he leaned heavily on an ancient Supreme Court precedent from the 1820 case United States v. Smith, which defined piracy strictly as a robbery executed upon the high seas. If no robbery had successfully taken place, then under this reading, no act of piracy had occurred. The lesser criminal charges remained intact, but the dismissal sent profound shockwaves through the entire international intelligence and defense community. If opening fire on a frontline warship in international waters could not legally be prosecuted as piracy, then the United States' legal claim to universal jurisdiction over Somali pirate networks was facing a catastrophic collapse. The victory for the defense was short-lived. On May 23, 2012, the United States Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit issued a unanimous ruling that completely vacated Judge Jackson's decision. Writing for the judicial panel, Judge Robert King stated that the modern definition of piracy under international law has evolved far past ancient precedents, and now encompasses any armed assault perpetrated on the high seas with clear piratical intent, completely regardless of whether that attack succeeds or fails. The case was remanded straight back to the federal courtroom in Norfolk. On February 27, 2013, a jury found Mohammed Farah and 4 of his co-defendants guilty on every single count, including the reinstated piracy charge. The final sentencing phase turned into a massive legal knot due to the rigid nature of United States federal statutes. Since the year 1909, The mandatory statutory penalty for a federal piracy conviction on the books has been life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Prior to 1909, the mandatory penalty was death. This meant the presiding judge possessed absolutely zero judicial